So in order to address this topic, we have our panelists, but we needed a moderator who knew something about this. I did know exactly nothing about that. Tone as well. Even less, exactly. So not Mir, not Leah, so we had to ask like a sacrificial, a scapegoat for this, and we asked the best guy able to take very complex technical topic and to make it understandable for normal people. And we all know that the best guy in the industry for that task is Aaron from Bitcoin Magazine. So I leave the floor to you. Thank you very much for this for being our guinea pig for this very complex topic. And the panel is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Giacomo. Thanks for setting up everyone's expectations there. I knew nothing about two of the three projects on the stage today until yesterday. But we'll get through it. Yeah, so my name is Aaron Van Wirdum. I am technical editor at Bitcoin Magazine. The name of our panel is Bitcoin Beyond the Internet, Unstoppable. Joined by AdamBack, who's representing the Blockstream satellite, ValerioVaccaro, who's representing LoRaWAN network, and RichardMyers, who's representing Gotenna. Adam, we'll start with you. Yours is the only project I knew a little bit about before today. So that's the Blockstream satellite. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it. When did it start? Why did it start? What is it?
Okay, it started a bit over a year ago, was the launch, and a couple of months ago we did a second part of the launch, which is to add additional coverage. So now we have much closer to global coverage. For last, the bandwidth is leased. So like backing up a bit, what is the Blockstream satellite? So it's a satellite network. It's not physical. We're leasing bandwidth on commercial satellites that are broadcasting TV or other industrial applications. So we lease a bandwidth allocation.
Is this a single company you're renting this from, or are there several?
So we try to get some diversity. So the satellites are operated and owned by different companies globally.
How many satellites are there?
There are 4 satellites and 5 transponders and 6 coverage zones. So one of the satellites has 2 transponders.
A transponder is the thing that's actually on the Earth, or not?
No, the transponder is a kind of broadcast. I mean, basically the satellite has not much adaptive intelligence. Most of the intelligence is on the ground. So you're from the ground station, and we have our own physical ground stations. We broadcast the Bitcoin data up in an analog format, and the satellite basically sends it back in a broadcast pattern to cover land areas. So it's not a single dish on the antenna broadcasting down. It's a collection of smaller dishes pointing to cover landmass, so that it doesn't cover the oceans, for example. So that's for the satellites are kind of power limited, because they're collecting their power from solar arrays. So they want to use the power for broadcast efficiently. So yeah, we broadcast. So we connect the uplink sites to redundant internet connections and connect them to the Bitcoin network, and then they broadcast Bitcoin transactions and blocks when they arrive up to the satellite, and it broadcasts it globally.
So both individual transactions and blocks?
Yes, so that was a switch. The original launch had blocks only. The launch we did a couple of months ago that added additional coverage for Asia and Pacific regions. It's a single satellite with 2 transponders covering both regions. We also switched over the protocol to send the transactions first and then use compact blocks to send the blocks when they arrive. And I think it's more interesting to have real-time transactions, because it gives you, if you're using the satellite to receive transactions, it gives you faster notification that the transaction is, it's not confirmed, but it's on the way, it's pending, and that's useful information. So yeah, it basically broadcasts that information. It's actually redundantly broadcast, so it's broadcasting 5 times over the same data in a 24-hour window. So if you had you know, a 6-hour power cut, you'll recover within some hours.
Okay, let's move to Valerio then. LoRaWAN network. This is one of them. I had never heard of this, so please explain.
Okay, ciao. And I start to say that in my previous life, working life, I was working in a IoT lab. So I was working with IoT protocol, Internet of Things protocol. The Internet of Things are the technology that allow you to connect your toothbrush to the Internet. Maybe you don't want it really, but it's very interesting because they develop a lot of interesting protocol, and LoRaWAN is very interesting protocol that allow you to cover the last mile. I mean, if you have some device that maybe cannot have internet, or you don't want to connect to internet, you can use this kind of low energy, wide range protocol in order to communicate with other node or with some anchor and broadcast this information to the internet or to your server, or and it's an open protocol.
It uses radio basically to find a node nearby that then connects to the internet.
Yeah, it uses it's a protocol that can work in three different three different kind of radio in different spectrum, like in 169 megahertz or 433 or 868 megahertz, because these three bands are free worldwide. So they develop some protocol that can use some bands that are licensed for free. So you don't need to pay, and you have only to follow the regulation, and you can use freely.
Yeah, so there doesn't need to be someone in your neighborhood that's collecting all of these radio signals and then rebroadcast it, right?
Yeah, if you use this kind of radio broadcast, you usually have a lot of anchor that collect information and send somewhere. In the LoRaWAN idea, you have some anchor that collect your information and send to a kind of centralized server that can broadcast back. But the protocol is standard, the frequency is standard, so you can create many different anchor that hear the same radio signal, that follow the same radio signal. The only difference is if you know or if you don't know the cryptographic key that are used for encrypt the payload of the message.
Yeah, so you're building this for Bitcoin, and you're integrating this with Bitcoin somehow. So you're transmitting Bitcoin transactions in that case, right?
I will show how you can use this LoRaWAN technology for send a Bitcoin transaction.
Right. All right. Last panelist is RichardMyers, representing Gotenna, which is also a radio-based solution, but I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, so I work at Gotenna. I had one on my band here, but so it's also a radio-based solution, consumer radio-based solution. And what the Gotenna radio is actually, it's not a Bitcoin-developed item. It's actually a consumer radio that pairs with your cell phone to allow you to send messages in a peer-to-peer way. So when you send a message over your Gotenna radio paired to your cell phone, it goes to any radio within range, and if that's your destination, it goes directly. But if your destination is further and there are radios in between, then the mesh technology, what that means is it's going to hop from phone or from Gotenna to Gotenna till it gets to the destination. So that's,
can you show one? Do you have one in your pocket or anything?
Yeah, I was going to take one out. So sometimes it's helpful to see the size. So it's got a battery and a radio transmitter built into this package here.
So is it forwarding messages right now or transmitting anything, or no? It needs to be connected to your phone.
Yeah, but I'll turn it on here. So if somebody, yeah, actually it has to pair with my phone. So if it was paired with my phone, then it would be relaying automatically for anybody that's out there and handling the routing of messages, etc.
Right, and this is now compatible with Bitcoin.
So we have an open SDK which allows anybody to build applications for Android, iOS, or now Python. Soon, other languages as well. But so the Samurai Wallet guys have a Mule Tools, something called the Mule Tools project, which is focused on what we're talking about today, sending Bitcoin transactions in an off-grid manner. So they created this project called TX10, and TX10 takes a raw Bitcoin transaction, breaks it up into the size frames that you can send over these radios, sends it out, and then it'll get relayed over these radios, like I mentioned. And then when it reaches a radio that's also running TX10 but has internet connectivity, so another cell phone, for example, with mobile connectivity, it'll reassemble them, put them on the Bitcoin blockchain, and there's more to it as well, but it'll actually send back a receipt, just informational. It's not a sort of secured receipt in any way, but informationally it'll tell you that it got to the blockchain, and it'll also tell you when there's a confirmation.
Do you have any idea what's the reach of these things nowadays? Like
radio-wise?
Yeah, like can you just put it on everywhere and will it work? Are there GoTennas close enough to you?
Oh, you mean like is the network built out already? Yeah, that's very. I mean, that's going to vary, and this is, it is a decentralized technology. There's no GoTenna as a company is not placing base stations around town, making sure there's full coverage. So that's a big difference. Of course,
how far does one GoTenna reach?
So the range is about 4 miles in U.S. Like around my house, I get about 1.8 kilometers. We've had 4 or 5 kilometers, 6 kilometers is quite standard if you've got like a good vantage point. So like open air between the radios is going to help. But yeah, so you could say 6 kilometers is possible if you place it in the right place. We have had people that use these in ultralight gliders. So, I mean, our community, we have multiple communities that use these. And they've gotten, I believe, something like 40 miles point to point. So,
right.
So there are, it depends a little on the terrain, but the range can be high. But the battery lasts about a day.
So it's not, you can't send a message to the other side of the world right now. But it's like used in hubs of communities for specific use cases.
Yeah, I think you can think of it as sort of a hierarchy of communication. This would be more community-based communication.
Right.
And you would expect there to be some sort of gateway, satellite, for instance, or high-frequency radio, different things like that. That could be your bridges between local communities. That's typically how I think about it.
Right. So is there like a Bitcoin hub anywhere? Like, is there a reason for people to use it with Bitcoin, or do you know anything about this?
I'm not sure what you mean by a hub, but like if they're a community where people are doing this. I mean, this just came out in October of last year, so it's still pretty new. I would say most people who are downloading and installing the app are doing it just for test purposes. And I think in most cases, people will probably initially use them just for their own communities. So if you want to be able to securely or privately send transmissions back to your home node, for example, this would probably be something that would be early way to do it. But as far as getting a fully meshed community, it doesn't have to be a Bitcoin community because people could be running them for any reason. So, for example, the company GoTenna is located in Brooklyn, and they've made an effort with the city for like disaster preparedness to pass these things around town. So I expect some places like that will be the first where you could have a ubiquitous mesh.
Right, and these machines, these devices just forward any message. Does it, like, even
exactly.
if it's not Bitcoin users, they'll still forward the Bitcoin message?
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
It doesn't worry about that. It's only that the endpoints are talking about Bitcoin at that point.
Yeah. Valerio, do you have any idea if people are using something like your solution with Bitcoin already, or where it would be used?
Okay, with Bitcoin, no. I never hear, and this was very interesting to test it. But I use LoRaWAN, and on top of LoRaWAN, there are some community of makers that use for different scenario. The biggest one is the Things Network, that allow you to join the community and put some gateway in your home and give everyone the access of this LoRa gateway. And actually there are 7,000 gateways in the world, 2 in Malta. And for the demo, I will turn on my gateway because it's a community of makers, so they turn on sometimes it's off. So actually, there are a lot of ideas, a lot of interest, but there is no a lot of real solution using this technology, and on Bitcoin nobody uses.
Right. So to stay in the domain of like reach, you mentioned Adam, the Blockstream satellite is currently available almost everywhere, but not quite everywhere. Where is it available? Where isn't it available?
So it's available to most people by population count, but there is a sort of definitional dead zone at the North and South Pole because the geostationary satellite can't go below a certain angle. And there is a gap in Eastern Europe between the Europe coverage and the Asia coverage that is not covered at the moment.
So basically every continent except for a small strip.
Right.
Right. And do you know if people are actually using this for Bitcoin people, I mean?
Yeah, I mean, a number of people have set them up, mostly sort of enthusiasts. We also, there are a number of use cases and reasons why people are excited about it. So, when you first hear about it, people are kind of think of space as science fiction, so they're kind of excited to like that Bitcoin is broadcasting everywhere from space, but it has a number of practical uses as well. So, and another reaction that you sometimes hear is, well, I have a high-speed internet connection, why do I need a satellite? And there are some answers to that, even for people in developed countries who have high-speed internet. Now, obviously, for the emerging markets, it's quite interesting because, there's a global map of Bitcoin full nodes, and you can see that there are very few in the African continent, and there's a software developer in Africa, Tim Akinbo, who's running like the only full node in Nigeria. And the reason is the bandwidth required to run a full node, which is about 10 gigabytes a month minimally, is like more than the average salary. So they have because it's an emerging market, the cost base is lower, the average salaries are lower, but also the internet connection is more expensive even in dollar terms because it's rarer, there's less economy of scale, and things are less reliable on the infrastructure side. So for those applications in emerging markets to increase the global reach of Bitcoin, it's actually quite interesting to get bulk data from the satellite because the bandwidth is free because it's a passive broadcast technology, and the equipment you need to receive it is like $100 of equipment. Software-defined radio will show some of the equipment in the demo later on. But for people in developed countries with very reliable high-speed internet, you still have interesting possibilities because it's better for privacy and security. So if you are receiving, if you're running a full node and you're not using Tor, your full node is going to be recognized and connected to by multiple peers on the peer-to-peer network that now know your IP address. They can see that you are sending Bitcoin transactions. They can look up from the IP address, typically your home address, or within a couple of houses. And as we know, there are people with various intents spying on the Bitcoin network and collecting data. So it's not just a few peers, but people systematically spying. Some of them may be doing it for risk management reasons, but others may be doing it for negative reasons, like they're trying to identify residences that make large Bitcoin transactions to burgle the house or something, right? So for sort of privacy and security, it's a pretty good idea to connect to the network for that reason. And there are other reasons for sort of more complicated reasons. So Bitcoin is a global network, and it's relying on a globally consistent view. Like that's the blockchain thing with miners, right? That there should be one valid chain. Now, if you're in an island country like Malta and somebody digs up undersea cable with a fishing boat or an anchor and you cut the country off from the network, maybe there are some local miners and the network continues, but you have the wrong view of the network. And that could be dangerous, you know, if you didn't realize for a few hours and you accepted a transaction. So it's useful for businesses that are processing transactions as a kind of redundancy. And one particular case, which is where it can be very expensive to lose a network connection, is mining. So some of the mines are in very remote locations by, you know, a hydro dam that was used for industrial purposes, or sometimes in China they build infrastructure before they build the town. So they're kind of unused dams. And like sometimes there's effectively no internet, or rural locations with cheap power. And so I've heard, you know, of people in industrial mining having double internet failures at a data center remote location and struggling to maintain mining while using like a GPRS internet connection on a smartphone for a whole mine. And you know, they can lose like $1 million a day in the worst case, right? So for them, they could actually mine using the satellite for the bulk data, and if they find a block, they could broadcast it in a number of ways that are more expensive or lower bandwidth.
Yeah, and it could also have like censorship-resistant properties in that way, right? You mentioned China. Like if China would try to block off Bitcoin from the firewall.
Yeah, I mean,
do you see that as a?
I mean, historically, you know, even in the last decade, there have been political turmoil in some countries fairly close to here, actually. You know, in the Arab Spring, for example,
right,
where I think Egypt, for example, there were technical people commenting that you know, the government pretty much shut the internet off during the military coup and you know, revolution. And you know, if you can't communicate on social media, you can't communicate on telephones. The cell network is down intentionally. Satellite communications is like basically all that's left. And sometimes I think they try to use dial-up with international phone numbers when there's still a way out. But yeah, I mean, the satellite is able to keep operating in this environment, and it's also completely passive. So you're, you know, if you've got a satellite dish pointed at a satellite, it's the same satellite that provides satellite TV, so nobody knows that what the purpose of the dish is, or you can probably put a satellite dish out of sight of the street, and you would have better safety from people not knowing that you're transacting, and better availability that you could continue to transact securely in a time when it actually mattered. I mean, this might be a time where the local currency is unstable or banking infrastructure is disrupted.
Richard, something like Gotenna, do you see it more as a fallback in case the internet fails, or does it have benefits in itself? Like, well, what are the benefits of using Gotenna?
Sure. I think there's sort of the basic benefits of any of these off-grid kind of communication technologies. One is censorship resistance. So if you are in a situation like Adam described there, where they're shutting off the internet, maybe specifically for you, I mean, that is maybe a little more theoretic, but or just generally they're shutting off perhaps that style of communication. That's something like they can maybe block Tor, they could potentially block internet communication for applications like Bitcoin. You could have something like mesh as an alternative. But that's also the privacy aspect as well. I think where with the satellite you're gaining the privacy of being able to download the blocks, the whole blockchain, without anybody necessarily knowing you're doing that. Mesh would be the sort of opposite direction. So you could send a transaction and it would be obscured through multiple hops. So it'd be very difficult to track back to where that transaction came from physically. I mean, of course, there's other ways to do it. This is just one of many ways, but it is probably its biggest use case for a Bitcoin scenario.
Yeah, because both of your solutions are kind of a one-way solution. The satellite is for getting transaction, and then you can send it. So it's a good combination, I guess. It's a good interoperability. Yeah. You know,
I mean, it'd be good to use them in combination. And you know, there are other forms of communication. So where you could receive Bitcoin data over it, but it would be super expensive, where transactions themselves are very small. You know, they're a few hundred bytes. So, for example, in emerging markets, people typically do have internet. It's just GPRS or 3G on smartphones, but the cost per megabyte is, you know, $1 or something, right? So they don't want to receive 10 gigs a month, because that's, you know, if a high-speed DSL connection is more than a month's salary, receiving the blockchain over GPRS is probably more than a year's salary or per month or something, right? So it will be very expensive. But nevertheless, if you've got the bulk data coming from the satellite, even if it's $10 a megabyte, sending an individual transaction is going to be like a cent or something because it's so small. And you can also send, I mean, the Blockstream satellite service doesn't have bidirectional capability, but there are bidirectional satellite internet solutions that are, again, expensive per megabyte. But you know, there are portable solutions where you point a small portable dish in the general direction of a satellite, and they do cost a lot per megabyte, but they're bidirectional, so you could send transactions through that. And so, you know, you could imagine a really off-grid, weak infrastructure scenario, you know, oasis in a desert or in a low, you know, area with low infrastructure, that somebody could use one of these bidirectional services and share it via mesh networking or Wi-Fi hotspots, plus a satellite dish. So they'll be able to, you know, accept transactions with full security with a full node, and share an uplink and charge the people, you know, who are sending 1 cent to send, sort of pass on the cost.
This is a question for Valerio and Richard. And we mentioned sending transactions. What about if you're a miner and you want to send blocks to the network? That would be too big, or would that be viable? Or
okay. Maybe the header you can send and broadcast to. I have this node, and I use this node, so it's well recognized for sending transaction. I can add and receive every header. The block is maybe too big, and it's not about the. It's about the bandwidth, but you have time, but you can use a kind of property of LoRaWAN and other solution that you can collect all your messages in a queue, and when you turn on your radio, you will receive all your messages. So it's better if you receive just the header and not all the block, or maybe you will need a lot of time to receive all the information, but you can do it.
On the topic of privacy, I think with LoRaWAN, I had to look up the name again, LoRaWAN solution, you can also send transactions encrypted, right?
Yeah. You have two encryption key, one for the network, so you have to know the encryption key of the network just for decode the payload and recognize what is. But okay, the header of the message. But if you want decode the payload, you have another key, the application key. And if you don't know the application key, you recognize that someone is sending this message, but you cannot watch what is inside the message because it is encrypted with another key.
Is something like this possible with GoTenna, or is it plain text? Or?
No, GoTenna is also end-to-end encrypted. I mean, we have two modes. You can do a broadcast, which is sent out sort of omnidirectional to everybody, and that's not encrypted because it's meant to be sent to everybody. But if you have the GID of somebody, you can send a private. It'll negotiate a key exchange, so you can send private communications. So, and it's interesting to think about encryption, because one of the interesting things about, I believe this is true for LoRa as well as GoTenna, is these are on what they say is unlicensed spectrum. But if you're using something like a ham radio spectrum, there's actually different rules that come into play. So we can encrypt our communications on these unlicensed spectrum. But if you were sending over a ham radio, in the US at least, it's not allowed to actually encrypt it. There's rules about that.
All right, let's talk about limitations a little bit. Sending a Bitcoin transaction out to the network over radio, that's perfectly possible. What about like a Lightning transaction? That would be a lot more tricky, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, we thought about that in terms of moving towards bidirectional satellite or mixing Lightning with unidirectional satellite and expensive low bandwidth like GPRS or mesh networks. And I mean, Lightning is fairly compact on data. The biggest thing is the routing table, which, because it's source routed, you connect to the network and you download a map of the entire network. And obviously that grows as the network becomes bigger. So one of the things in the future of Lightning is more efficient and incremental or partial routing based on partial information. But that is a bit of a difficulty, because you want to keep the Lightning channels local. So maybe much of the trade, let's say, in a marketplace in Africa is like local trade. So they could have local channels that are happening over the mesh network, over a Wi-Fi hub. But occasionally there will be, channels going internationally, and those are, I think, some of the advantages of Lightning start to be lost, which is, okay, the bandwidth is expensive and it's doing international things. So, multi-hop routes that go internationally start to become difficult. So it's an area where you benefit from locality, basically.
Yeah, this is something that we've also looked at. I think there's certainly an aspect of the current protocol, which it was obviously envisioned for the internet. It wasn't envisioned, so the gossip protocol is not, it would have to be adapted, obviously. I think that there is probably a use for that, and it could potentially go the other direction too, in the sense that, people who are using mesh networks may not only want to send payments, they may want to communicate. And Lightning actually offers an interesting way to incentivize people to run nodes that would relay to a gateway, or for instance, have a satellite uplink and pay for that, like Blockstream does now for their messages, paying an uplink via something like Lightning. You could also pay relays via Lightning. So this could be a way for sort of incentivizing mesh generally, not just for payments. At least that's one way that I've been looking at, and I think it's an interesting question to pursue.
I think you can use LoRaWAN for send other information like Lightning transaction, or follow all the protocol, and it will be very interesting for Lightning for IoT device, maybe, in which maybe you don't have Wi-Fi, or you don't have direct connection to the internet, and maybe you have something that working on battery, so you want to save power also. So you can create some protocol that use LoRaWAN for exchange information, but you have to be sure that it's you create a redundant channel, because a lot of time you can, if you have to send a very big message, you have to divide in pieces, and you have to be sure that you receive all pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about the difference between a Bitcoin transaction and a Lightning transaction, one of the noticeable differences is the recipient has to be online when you're sending a Lightning transaction typically. Right. And also if you looked at your network when the transaction was being sent, in Bitcoin it's, okay, the recipient doesn't have to be online, and you just send a message to the peer-to-peer network and you walk away. Like, you don't stay online. It's one message, not interactive. Where with Lightning, it's like a connection-oriented thing. Like, you have to establish a TCP connection or something with the same characteristics, and then you have to engage in a interactive cryptographic protocol that is actually navigating multiple hops. So it is quite efficiently optimized in terms of the amount of bytes it uses. There are a lot of effort put into keeping it low cost CPU and bandwidth, but still it's got to maintain a connection long enough to maintain. One thought that we had to kind of make it less bandwidth and less interactive is to outsource the knowledge of the routing to a sort of semi-trusted node. And there are routing hints which are part of Lightning already, so you can get a hint on, if somebody sends you a payment request, you can get a hint on how to route to them already as part of the protocol, I believe. So, there are trade-offs you can make to make it more realistic.
Are there any, if you're relying on the Blockstream satellite for your blocks, what are the risks there? Because the information is coming from Blockstream exclusively, right? Do you see any risks there?
Yeah, so this is a quite interesting question, and the answer is counterintuitive in a couple of ways. So one way is that you can think of the different internet connections as macro redundancy, right? So you have an internet connection, but it's a bit expensive. You're worried that the government will censor it or something. You have another internet connection, it comes from Blockstream. So now you have 2 times the redundancy. So it's a little bit more decentralized. Previously you were relying on, let's say, a state monopoly telecom run internet connection in a country, and now you're relying on 2 different things. So that's a small increment. But the more...
If you use both.
Yeah, if you do both. Now, the more subtle argument is that you can... The information is a self-authenticated data stream. So in a way of thinking, the information that the satellite is sending to you, it couldn't modify if it wanted to, because it's like signed by the miners, like all the proof of work. So, you know, you can see that unless Blockstream had a lot of mining equipment, it wouldn't be able to make false information. And the last, even more subtle thing is that you can verify the information is correct with very low bandwidth. So you could connect with GPRS or LoRaWAN or, you know, any communication mechanism and receive the block header and check, is the satellite giving me the correct chain? And you actually see this effect in the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, because a typical Bitcoin full node will connect to 8 peers on average. And, you know, let's say that one of the peers is a very fast connection and the other ones are very slow. You know, you're not trusting the fast connection because you're still like cross-checking, well, is the header correct, you know? So if they were inconsistent, you would start to ignore the one that was wrong. And the same applies to the satellite. It's just, it's an extreme case of this where you've got, you know, a high-speed internet connection and, you know, a couple of very costly low-speed internet connections. So it's actually still peer-to-peer secure. Now, I think it would be a little bit unwise to rely only on the satellite. You should cross-check things. So don't trust, verify, and so on, right? But there's also a telephone number you can call, which reads the last block hash to you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What about the radio solutions? Are there any risks of censorship there? Like at some point it needs to access the internet, for example. Is that like a choke-in point, or? Yeah,
in LoRaWAN, the back end is based actually on internet. So it's you have some website that collect information. So they can they can censor some transaction, but actually if you use the encryption, they cannot recognize the payload. So there are a lot of people that are using LoRaWAN, so you have to recognize which one is using for broadcast Bitcoin transaction, and on the other hand, you can also decide to not trust in some centralized server and broadcast directly to using LoRaWAN to your node. But in this case you don't have a network, so you have to reach directly your node, and for LoRaWAN we are speaking about 10-20 kilometer maximum.
Right. Would you like to weigh in here? Or?
Yeah, just some things to think about. Basically, I mean, if you've got a SIM card from a provider, that ties it to your identity. So you'd also want to look for something like that in whatever you're using to broadcast your transactions. So in the case of GoTenna, and I'm sure this is true for LoRa too, you should be able to set your identity and have no other information going over the radio that ties it back to your device, like no MAC address or something equivalent to that. We don't do that, but that would be something you would want to be considering when you're trying to get it for privacy's sake. I mean, beyond that, it is short bursty data, which helps make it hard to localize, but I suppose if you had a really dedicated person trying to track you down and you stayed in one place, you could be tracked down through triangulation, but it would be quite difficult. And the whole idea of this kind of technology is it should be mobile. So from a privacy standpoint, that would be something to think about. And then just what he said earlier about if it's going to a particular receiver, that receiver, of course, could send to you, but the idea is that it's a redundant connection, or anybody could be a receiver, then that helps with that too. Yeah.
In the case of like a broad-scale state attack, like a censorship attack, would it be possible to distort satellite transmissions, or how well would this work in such a scenario?
I mean, they probably could have a go at jamming them because the signal is coming up from ground stations. There are many ground stations because they're commercial satellites broadcasting industrial data, but primarily satellite TV channels from different content providers with different uplinks. So they're international providers, right? They're covering areas that cover many countries, and it would just be a kind of geopolitical risk calculus that, you know, one country would be upset if somebody else was jamming the satellite that was affecting everybody. Because I don't think you could locally jam it. You just jam it in general. They can tell who is jamming it. They can triangulate where that's coming from. And I think the other kind of, you know, protection is that it's providing satellite TV, and people will get upset if they can't watch TV. You know, because it's kind of commingled across different services. But you know, it depends if there's political pressure to you know, stop providing the service. So it depends which country is asking.
What about political pressure on Blockstream? That could happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, from our analysis, we're providing data in a kind of similar way that people provide internet service. So, I mean, we've open sourced much of the technology is driven off software-defined radios. So there's actually source code for the signal encoding and decoding. So it's certainly possible for other people to provide similar services. But I think the most likely risk would be that, you know, it wouldn't be Blockstream, it would be the satellite providers that would be contacted.
All right, I think we have about 5 more minutes. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, come to the mic.
Okay, first question is for Adam. I remember when the Blockstream satellite started, there was talk about an app for dumb phones, basically, to send Bitcoin transactions as SMS. How would you go about protecting that against censorship? I mean, the target phone address can easily be shut down, right?
So actually, I think Pavel Rosnak is going to demonstrate this at the last panel, at the last demo today, is the SMS gateway. And Richard mentioned Mule Tools, which is a smartphone application from Samurai, which allows you to take Bitcoin transactions and put them through the GoTenor network. But the Mule Tools also supports SMS, and Pavel, who's going to demonstrate, is running an SMS gateway. Now, in terms of people's ability to censor SMS, I mean, I guess they could ask the SMS provider to stop providing service to this user, but I mean, it's probably not so hard to get another SIM. It's just, you know, if they want to switch off the SMS service for a whole country, that's too disruptive, right?
No, and I think you need to send the SMS to a specific address that knows that this is a Bitcoin transaction.
Yeah, exactly.
Purchase. And this will be a few phone numbers that some insiders will know, and they can be shut down. Right?
But I mean, it's a low-cost user initiative to set up the gateways. So if a particular gateway got shut off, you have this kind of Streisand effect. That would be news on the internet. You know, 100 open source developers would download the software and start competing ones, and then they'd be starting up new ones. And, you know, the disruption would be minor. In a sense, it would be like an arms race. Well, we shut this one down, but now there are 10 more. And we shut 2 of those down, and now there are 20 more. And it wouldn't go very far, because the only way they could ultimately stop people sending SMSs with these for this application would be to switch off SMS service, which is not really thinkable in most countries that they would be able to do that.
Okay, so it's basically the asymmetric warfare point. Okay, thank you. And then one for, I forgot your name, sorry, Gotena.
Richard.
I think 3 actually. One was, does it work just with a specific app, or does it generally relay IP traffic?
No, it's going to be tied to a particular app, and it's we have an open source SDK. So, like, Samurai made their own application for sending Bitcoin transactions, which is open source.
Okay, in that case, that was the last question. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Yep.
All right. Similar to what seemed to be an issue with Montepetris and DNS, it seemed as if there was a weighing of the trade-off between censorship resistance at the time and ensuring of scalability and usability to gain mass adoption. And this is to you, Adam, and I probably am way off here. But is there kind of a similar potential trade-off that may be apparent in order to gain that similar type of mass adoption that ensures that you reach the rest of the world, that it gets to that vision state that I think you guys have laid out?
So a trade-off between sensor resistance and scalability?
Right. And various other aspects of, I guess, Bitcoin that we love, but specifically, security, censorship resistance, and then, if that will deter from its ability to gain mass adoption.
Yeah, not specific to the satellite or the radio technology as such, but I think, we are in the equivalent of early internet stages where the bandwidth and technology wasn't scalable enough to provide video streaming for millions of users, but now it is. So it does seem that there are definitely some trade-offs between censorship resistance for Bitcoin and global scalability, because it's quite plausible if the technology, like one of our interests with the satellite is to provide global reach. So, okay, we broadcast the Bitcoin data. Like, technically, there are billions of people that could now receive it for very low cost. But if they all decided, if 1 billion of them decided to start transacting next year, Bitcoin would have a problem. It would be too popular, and it would get congested. And people, but Lightning is developing, and there are other layer 2 technologies on the table today. So I think if you combine everything into a single layer, you do get to a conflict where you want a very secure, sensor-resistant base layer, and it's more technically difficult to scale that kind of technology. Obviously, it's always easier to scale centralized things, and that's why we see, different layers and very clever protocols that are able to scale without broadcast, like Lightning. So I think it's a kind of likely to evolve that there will be more layer 2s, more optimizations, more protocol improvements, and different use cases using different layers that are optimized for those use cases. So it is a difficult trade-off, and that's what a lot of the companies building technology are working with, and open source developers working on improving protocols and finding new innovations to scale.
That's it? No more questions? All right, all 3 of you, are you going to give a demo as well, or is someone else doing that?
I'll do the demo.
All 3 of you will do a demo then. All right, I'll give it to Tone.
All right, guys, that was great. Thank you so much for the panel.